It's a second lecture for me, doing it on Zoom, so I'm still learning the ropes. But thanks so much for having me here, and thanks for allowing us to use this platform. The lecture is supposed to be a general lecture on heritage languages, so some of the stuff that I'm going to talk about will probably be very familiar, and some of the stuff is new, and the hope is that those people who know more can give a lot of feedback. And the title is due to the observation that people often talk about these types of languages, which are languages of recessive bilinguals, as somehow smaller or contracted. And my point is that not everything is lost in those languages. And in fact, what we see is just a very well-contained system with internal dynamics of its own without too much pressure from the outside, although of course it cannot be discounted. So that's kind of the main point. And what I'm going to do is, first of all, introduce the notion of heritage languages. As I said, some of you know what they are, but for those who may not have heard of them, I need to present them a little bit. Then I'll talk about why we actually need to bother learning about these languages. After that, I want to talk about the notions that we generally use in linguistics: complexity, simplicity, and regularity. And then I'll get to my main point of the talk, and that is whether or not we can actually predict the shape of heritage languages as we compare them to what's called the baseline. And so that's the main goal today. So let's start with the basics and the background. What are heritage languages and why they're relevant for linguistics? A heritage language speaker is a simultaneous or an early sequential bilingual, but not a second language learner. Typically, the cutoff is about 5 years of age. And so it could be someone who grows up hearing and possibly, but not necessarily speaking a language in the home. And often these people are called recessive bilinguals or imbalanced bilinguals. The idea is that they control 2 languages, but the dominant language of their society is something that they're much more comfortable with as adults. And so there are these 2 languages, but the home language is somehow weaker or less balanced than the language of the ambient society. So languages that count as heritage languages are those that are acquired naturalistically in the home context. They often, but not always, correspond to the minority language in the national society. There's a lot of discussion about whether or not these speakers count as native speakers, what should be understood as a definition of native speakers. I'm personally not very interested in this issue because I think this is an issue of definitions, but it's important to recognize them as native speakers because that validates their language competence. But the important thing for me is that these languages, heritage languages, are enclosed systems, and as systems, as linguistic systems, they're inherently fully consistent. What we call them seems less important. The term heritage language is actually quite new. It came from Canada in the 1990s, where it was used as the denotation for languages of the First Nations. But then in the 1990s, it started being used to denote the excuse me, language of weaker bilinguals. But although the term is new, and for example, in Europe, they use terms such as minority languages and other terms, we shouldn't be losing track of the fact that the phenomenon of imbalanced bilinguals is quite old as bilingualism itself. And so the bottom line is that a heritage language speaker is a first language speaker who has limited input in later stages of language acquisition. So that's the basic definition of what we're dealing with. We also know, as we look at heritage languages, that there is a tremendous range of variation in heritage populations, probably greater than what we find in monolingual populations. And this range of variation is determined by quite a few factors. The age of acquisition of the second L1, whether it's simultaneous or sequential bilinguals, the age when the second language gets introduced, the range of baseline speakers whose input counts as the input for this language around a given heritage speaker, the time when these heritage speakers join social groups using the dominant language. For example, in the States where I do most of my work, the usual cutoff point is around age 5 when they start socialization in preschool. The amount of dominant language use, the motivation of keeping the heritage language when they grow up, the societal status of the home language. So for example, there are a lot of heritage language speakers of Spanish in the United States, and generally the maintenance of Spanish is not as great as in some countries in Europe where the status of Spanish seems to be stronger or more prestigious. And there are many other factors. I'll come back to some of them. But again, I want to emphasize that I don't have much to say about the social factors or sociolinguistic factors. This is a very important area of study, just not what I do. So I'm going to talk primarily about linguistic factors. In terms of the trajectory of heritage speakers, excuse me, the schooling in the dominant language typically serves as the major factor which impedes the later stages of acquisition. In the United States, there is this typical 3-generation trajectory of language loss, where the first generation is an immigrant who barely speaks the dominant language, in this case English. The second generation is the immigrant's children who speak both languages, but as in Fishman's work, these languages are kitchen, ex-kitchen Italian, kitchen Spanish, and so on. And then by the third generation, the grandchildren of those immigrants who barely spoke English become monolingual speakers of English. And it's clear that a lot of societal power is stacked in favor of the dominant language. So we see the flattening of this trajectory, sometimes to a 2-generation trajectory of language loss. What we want to say is that heritage languages are relevant for linguists because this is a natural experiment which gives us an opportunity to see the range of grammar options and also to explore linguistic creativity where the input is restricted. So they have a relatively restricted input, and we want to see what options in natural language design survive and which ones actually become stronger and which ones are more recessive. So that in turn allows us to test existing theories, and then once we know what works and what doesn't work in existing theories, we can feed back to theoretical linguistics on the basis of new empirical data, and that's what makes these languages so attractive. So I'm going to play a video for you so you can then listen to one small sample of a heritage language. So first you'll watch a video, and that should be without sound. So some of you will recognize it. And now we're going to listen to a heritage speaker of English who is dominant in Hebrew. So she's going to talk about this video. So you saw the video, now listen to this girl talking about it.
Someone, there a little, I don't know what it's called, but something was in the cave. No, not cave.
Cage.
So, and there was like a thing that you put, the bird should be scared, and he ran away. Then he came behind her back, and she got scared, and then he took her, and he ran away, and then the dog came and ran after a cat. I don't know what it was.
Yeah, it's a cat.
Cat?
Yeah.
He ran after her, and then he pulled her foot and he fell and he jumped on. Then he, I don't know, he started playing with his foot, his, and he ran, or she ran away with one foot.
Okay, so this is an example of something that may be unthinkable because English is this indestructible language that everybody is supposed to speak. But here's an example of heritage English. So we have quite a collection of this English spoken by second generation immigrants who are dominant either in French or in Hebrew or in Japanese or in Hungary. So these are all countries where we can find significant English-speaking expat population. And what happens to English in those cases is what happens to pretty much any heritage language, and that is it becomes weakened. As you can see from this person's production, her pronunciation, her phonology is quite fine, but she's missing a lot of words, like she wasn't sure if the word for cage was really cage or cave, so she needed help with that. She has a lot of pauses because of lexical access. She didn't use past tense on pool. So there are a lot of morphological errors in her production. And more importantly, if you study the comprehension of these people, you can see that they're actually different from those who speak English as their first or dominant language. So this is an example showing that no language is immune, even the strongest language of the world, that is English. So what we know quite well is that the heritage language is different from the immigrant baseline, which serves as input for heritage language learners. And they're both different from the homeland language. So if we compare, let's say, Korean, in Korea, the language of Korean immigrants in France or in the United States, and then the language of their children, we'll find quite a number of differences, and we'll also find a level of overlap. So we know quite well that the differences exist. What we don't know as well is what exactly the differences are, how they distribute across production versus comprehension, what language domains are affected, and what we also need to learn is how to predict the change in heritage languages. And once we know the answers to those questions, what and how, we can actually address the bigger question, why, and that is what the mechanisms are behind the observable changes. And so what I want to do now that I've introduced heritage speakers and heritage languages, talk about the issues of complexity, simplicity, and regularity, and then talk about the question of how can we predict the changes, and if we do, then we can start addressing the why question. Let me now turn to complexity and regularity. As I said before, it's commonly assumed that heritage languages are often subject to attrition or simplification, and it seems to be a reasonable move because we are often interested in seeing what's missing rather than seeing what actually happens that's correct. And I'm going to show you, I'm having a problem with the picture here. So okay, I'll have to do it this way, and then I'll come back to the full screen. So there are some examples which actually show that simplification is the case. So if you look at heritage English and regular English, what we find is that inverse scope that English is so famous for is not available in heritage English. So if you look at the picture in the slide and you hear a pirate is holding every bottle, for English speakers, this is fine. That's an example of inverse scope. But if you give the same kind of example, the same picture to heritage English speakers, they will reject it. So that shows that heritage English speakers do not have inverse scope. And this is something that has been shown in a lot of work, including our own work, and then the work by Esther Ronay on heritage English in Hungary, excuse me. And it's systematic that heritage English gets rid of inverse scope. And so we see that there are some examples where there is simplification, but what exactly counts as simplification? What's the opposite of simplification? So this is where three notions come in: complexity, simplification, and regularity. Complexity is quite difficult to define, and in principle, it can be established in relation to the entire system, in which case I think we're lost, to the inventory, and that is, are you going to have more segments, more lexical items, more categories, or it could be rules operating on signals. So I highly recommend the book by Oostendal, where he discusses these two notions of complexity. The conclusion of the book is kind of a little open-ended, where he says, you know, it could be rules operating on inventories or rules operating on signals, so it's a little hard to decide what exactly the point is. And so what counts as simplification may be either shrinking resources or loss of rules. So you can lose signal materials such as lexical items, phonetic segments, and so on. You can eliminate grammatical distinctions and categories, like the elimination of inverse scope, which I just showed. Or it could also be that heritage languages establish isomorphism between form and meaning, where one form must have one meaning. So all these notions have been brought up in the discussion of complexity, and depending on which one you use, you can talk about things being more or less complex. So complexity seems to be a fairly elusive notion. Regularity is a little easier to deal with, and basically when we look at regularity, we can go back to the basic distinction between core and periphery, where the core goes into deep regularities of language, which are governed by such things as parameter settings, and the periphery is left for marked exceptions. And so if we look at the core system, putting aside the phenomena that result from historical accident or personal idiosyncrasies, what we see is that the regular properties come from the core and the irregular come from the periphery. So this is a very simple chart showing the differences between core and periphery. The core is regular, universal, available. You often find correlation with other properties in the linguistic system. You can evaluate core properties with respect to alternative hypotheses. And then such things as markedness and discreteness come in, but those are, again, a little harder to define. Periphery is characterized by the absence of regularity or universal availability. So what I want to emphasize is that not all changes in heritage language amount to simplification, and instead it might be helpful to view changes in heritage language as changes which produce greater regularity, which means that we have the extension of core at the expense of the periphery. And if we look at it that way, the system is not simpler or more complex, it's just more regular. So let me give you another example from Heritage English, because this is where we can all rely on shared knowledge. In Heritage English, irregular verbs become regular. However, some very frequent verbs still stay irregular. So you have forms like wented. Some speakers use went, and the crucial thing is that they accept went, even if they say wented. But you also see things like break, shine, striked, and so on. So there is a great irregularization in morphology. A more interesting example comes from particle verbs. In baseline English, you can have a verb pronoun and particle, but not verb particle pronoun, because pronouns are clitics in this construction, and so you cannot have this sequence. In Heritage English, particles get reanalyzed as adverbs, and so what you have is both combinations. So in baseline English, you can only have lock him up, whereas in Heritage English, speakers accept both lock him up and lock up him, and they produce both. So that shows that we're getting some more regularization, but this regularization is not random. It just comes from the fact that particles themselves were reanalyzed as adverbs, and as many heritage languages, Heritage English gets rid of weak pronoun. So the idea was that in Heritage English, you see this expansion of the system. Earlier, I showed you that Heritage English loses inverse aspects. So you can say, oh, you know, the system becomes more simplified. But in this case, with particle verbs, you actually see what could be considered an expansion of the system, where both verb pronoun particle and verb particle pronoun become acceptable. But again, this is not accidental. That's because Heritage English loses clitic pronouns, and we see evidence from comprehension and production that Heritage English reanalyzes particles into adverbs. So what you have here is the leveling where irregular verbs become, become regular, and you also have, you have reanalysis of particles as adverbs. So the main takeaway point from that is that changes in heritage languages are not always simplification, and instead we can see them as leading to greater regularity in the system. And as a result, the heritage language does appear different from the baseline, but this difference is not accidental. What we still don't know, aside from outside of heritage studies, is how to evaluate complexity. So my feeling is that it might be better to stay away from it unless and until we have a good complexity metric. So again, not all changes amount to simplification, and a lot of recurrent changes that we see in heritage languages are due to the internal dynamics of the language itself, where the core, the regular system, is taking over the periphery. And so if that's the case, then, you know, it's natural to say that a heritage language is a language. These changes that we see are not always cases of simplification, and we can actually predict the changes on the basis of theory and then use these results to feed back into our theoretical work. And so now I go to my bigger question of the day, which I would have gotten to faster if not for the hackers. And that is the question of how can we actually predict change in heritage language? So I'm going to look at several factors here. And what we're going to do is just look at some examples for each factor. And then at the end, I'll try to wrap it all together. So if a heritage language does differ from the baseline, which seems to be obvious, can we predict the differences in which predict the way in which it will differ from the baseline? And so the factors which have been proposed and which also need to be tested further include such things as perceptual salience, structural salience, indexicality, linear and structural distance, and age of acquisition. I probably won't be able to get to age of acquisition, but I will do my best to cover the other factors which are here. So the salience can be defined in terms of perceptual salience, can be defined in various ways. It could be the weight of the segment, how long it is. It could be defined in syllabic weight or in terms of stress. And so although all these factors are important today, I will only be concerned with the segment weight, what Dahl in his work on complexity calls signal weight. And so if we're comparing two items, one of which is longer or it will be perceptually more salient than the other. So perceptual salience operates both within a language and across languages. So within a single language, if a category can be expressed in multiple ways, heritage languages invariably choose the form that is perceptually more salient. And that's not unique to heritage languages. We also find that in Creoles. So for example, if you look at Romance-based Creoles, all the pronouns in these Creoles are based on stronger pronouns. And so let's say, if it's a French-based Creoles, you don't see pronouns based on je, you always have some form of moi, which is perceptually more salient. If we look across heritage languages and look at the same category, it could be well maintained in one heritage language if it's expressed by a perceptually salient form, and that same category may be lost if it's expressed by perceptually less salient form. And I'll show you some examples in a moment. So within a single language, as I said, the particular category can be expressed in multiple ways, and then the heritage language chooses the more salient form. So if we look at an example from Salish, the language which is now called Ayajutham and used to be called Island Comox, in this language, there is a spread of reduplication in lieu of affixation. Reduplication is definitely perceptually more salient than light affixes. And so not only does it survive, but it actually takes over the domain, which originally was occupied by light affixation. Another example I want to give you comes from a language in Northeast Siberia, Chukchi, which used to have a uniform anti-passive morpheme. And this morpheme, which wasn't very small, it was, 3 segments in actually got replaced by incorporative anti-passive in heritage Chukchi. And this is where the lexical object gets incorporated. So let me give you an example so you could see what happens. So on the left, you see traditional Chukchi, the boy stroked the dog. And so what you have is the prefix ana on the verb, and then the dog is in the dative case. So it's not in the absolutive case as it should be if it were a direct object. In modern day Chukchi, this prefix ana is gone. And instead what happens is that every time there is an equivalent of anti-passive, the language incorporates what was the object. And the structure, as a result, doesn't become any less complex because you have morphophonological rules that determine the combination of segments into polysynthetic word. The lexical item, as you can see from this example, actually undergoes some phonological change when it undergoes the incorporation. But the lexical item in the incorporative anti-passive is way more visible than the anti-passive prefix. And so the change from regular anti-passive to this incorporative anti-passive is quite predictable, quite expected. So in modern speakers, we don't have any evidence of prefixal anti-passive. And then what you also see in production is that more proficient speakers use incorporative anti-passive, whereas less proficient speakers use a regular transitive, but do accept incorporation and comprehension. So they don't produce certain things, but they still accept it. And that's important because a lot of work on heritage languages is based on what these people produce. And it's important to not only track their production, but also to test them in comprehension, the way we did, for example, for heritage English, because you can see that certain things may be gone or incorrect in production just because of online pressures, but they're still present in the comprehension system. So that's one of the many examples where production and incomprehension go different ways. Perceptual salience also has a relation to what we know from prosody as strong start. And the idea is that weak elements are not tolerated at the left edge of a prosodic constituent. So whatever is relatively low in the prosodic hierarchy is not going to be on the left. And so the strong start says, don't start the intonational phrase with a prosodically deficient element. So one of the elements which is subject to strong start is clitics. And as a consequence, all factors being equal, we expect that enclitics should be preferred over proclitics in heritage language, because proclitics would violate strong start. And that's exactly what we find. So if we look at heritage European Portuguese, which is studied quite a bit in the work by Rink and Flores, you see that heritage speakers actually know their clitics. They know the grammar of clitics, but they put them in the wrong place. They put them after the word, not before the word, where in the baseline European Portuguese, you're going to get proclitics. And we're seeing the same in heritage Bulgarian and my ongoing work with Tanya Ivanova. We don't have any results yet to show, but the initial findings seem very similar to what we see in European Portuguese. There is a different example which comes from heritage Norwegian, where in composite definites, which many of you know, there seems to be a prevalence of suffixal determiners. That's in the recent dissertation by Yvonne van Baal, who studied heritage Norwegian in the United States. And notice that this couldn't be transferred from English because in English, determiners, of course, precede the noun. So again, this might be just the observance of strong start. And I'm not saying that strong start is not present in baseline languages, but it becomes much more important, much more prevalent in the grammar of a heritage language, and accounts for some of their rearrangement due to perceptual salience. A lot of these data on enclitics and data on heritage Norwegian are from production, so we don't know again whether this is perceptual salience, which is limited to online limitations, or it is something that has already resulted in language change. So in Bulgarian, what we're doing now, we're studying their comprehension. So if we see that they actually accept more of enclitics, then that's an indication that this has been internalized as part of the grammar. Now let me talk about perceptual salience in comparison across heritage languages. As I said before, the same category may be maintained in language A if it's expressed by perceptually salient form, and may be lost in language B if the same category is expressed by perceptually non-salient form. And a good example is differential object marking. Differential object marking, of course, exists in a lot of languages, several of which have been studied as heritage languages. So Spanish differential object marking has been compared to differential object marking in Romanian and Hindi. And what we find is that DOM in heritage Spanish is generally gone, and that's because I is quite low in perceptual salience and it undergoes attrition quite easily. We have much more salient visible markers. In Hindi, it's also a suffix. And these appear more resilient. Moreover, Romanian P seems to generalize as the object marker in heritage language. So that's in the work by Bateman and Motrul. Again, a lot of that is from production, so I don't know if heritage speakers of Romanian perceive P as the object marker in comprehension, but in production, that seems to be the case. And again, the difference is just in perceptual salience and signal weight. Perceptual salience also manifests in what we've called the silent problem, and that is that heritage speakers differ from the baseline in their ability to identify and evaluate missing elements. And what often happens is that heritage languages eliminate silence, where they replace null pronouns with avert ones. There is elimination of ellipsis in acceptive constructions, something that I've been working on lately. In long distance dependencies, they spell out both lengths of a chain. So that happens in relative clauses where you have the resumptive instead of a trace, or in topicalization. And sometimes there are more interesting, more subtle cases of internal changes which respond to the silent problem. For example, in heritage European Portuguese, the null objects are no longer interpreted as minus animates. So in other words, there is this extra feature on the null element which is eliminated, and that makes the recovery of this null element a little easier. So again, this is sort of a response to perceptual salience in an interesting way. But it's not all about perceptual salience, because heritage languages are also very sensitive to structural salience. And here what we see is that highest functional nodes within a given phrase are typically resilient, whereas intermediate constituents, oops. Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I'm having something with microphone. I was worried that maybe it's another hacker. We also see that highest constituents hold special status in grammatical computation, possibly due to many research. So let me give you some examples. We find that D level and T level in heritage grammars are quite intact, whereas lower levels within the DP and the clause are generally affected by change. In comprehension, if you give heritage speakers any mismatches in person features, they generally react to them just as baseline speakers. They're very sensitive to that, as opposed to mismatches in gender and number, of which heritage speakers are much more accepting than baseline speakers. So let me show you some examples from tense. So if you look at L2 English, where tense has been studied quite a lot, there are a lot of tense errors in second language English. So second language speakers of English mix up simple tense and progressive. So there are errors like I was speaking English in 2010, we read this book now. There is a mix up between present perfect and simple tense. So in 2010, I have gone to Paris. And present instead of future, tomorrow I go to the beach if it will not rain. So things like that. This has been studied quite a bit. We also see that even after a lengthy exposure, L2 learners of English make occasional mistakes of tense and production. That's been particularly well studied in the work by Donald Ardier, who looked at the speaker of English who has lived in the States for about 30 years, and this person's still making very similar tense mistakes. The important thing is that L2 speakers of English also accept wrong tense in comprehension. So it's not just about production. Now, if we look at our heritage English speakers, the ones that I've shown you before, we looked at the ones who are dominant in French and Hebrew, they don't make any production errors in the choice of tense. They do make a lot of prominent verbal system errors. Otherwise, they omit or overmark third singular present. I already showed you regularized past tense. They use non-baseline verb particle constructions. So here are some examples where we can compare heritage speakers and L2 speakers in terms of accepting or rejecting errors in tense use. So the slide is a little busy. So what I would do, I would ask you to compare the blue and the orange, because these are the percentages of acceptances. So if you give a speaker something, like I was speaking English in 2010, you can see that heritage speakers are very low at accepting that, whereas L2 speakers accepted at almost 50%. We read this book now. Again, heritage speakers barely accept something like that, whereas if you look at the orange bar, you can see that L2 speakers are very, very accepting that. In 2010, I've gone to Paris. L2 speakers are almost at 65%. Heritage speakers reject that. And so if we go on this graph, the pattern is exactly the same, and that is that heritage speakers are very, very sensitive to the wrong use of tense, whereas L2 speakers are not. So heritage speakers of English are native-like in their production and comprehension of tense distinctions. And although these are speakers of English, the same results are available for very low proficiency speakers who speak Inuktitut, recessive bilinguals. They make tons of errors, but when Marina Sharkina-Lieber and her colleagues showed them some tense mismatches for comprehension, they were incredibly accurate in accepting the correct forms and rejecting the incorrect. At the same time, what we find is that heritage speakers are quite different from the baseline in their production and comprehension of aspect. And that has been shown for a variety of languages, for Spanish, Russian, Mandarin, and Cantonese, different aspect systems. Nevertheless, we have the same result. Tense is intact, aspect is pretty well known. And so that goes well with this idea that tense is a higher projection as opposed to aspect. And if you look at the predicate phrase, voice seems to appear intact. So again, we're looking at the higher projection. So in heritage Spanish, say is regularly added to verbs in production, and this extra say is also accepted in comprehension. But we don't quite have all the results for that one. So I would probably wait in terms of the judgment on that. At the same time, you see that aspect applicatives and causatives are often affected across heritage languages. So I'm going to skip the gender and number and talk about the special status of highest constituents in grammatical computation, because they play a role in the structure of heritage language. So if we hold all other factors constant, subject agreement in heritage languages is expected to be more resilient than object agreement, but that has to be with all 5 features held constant, because if you have subject agreement in person and object agreement in just number, then you're looking at person-number distinction. But in the language where both subject and object agreement is in the same 5 feature, we can predict that subject agreement should be more resilient. Subject advantage becomes more prominent than in the baseline. A good example is the famous position of antecedent strategy in Romance, which has been studied for languages like Italian or Spanish. So if you have something like when Mario phoned Giovanni, pro or he had just finished eating. So for baseline speakers, the antecedent, which is not the subject, is interpreted as the antecedent of the verb pronoun, whereas the null pronoun is interpreted as having the antecedent in the specifier T position. So it's basically subject, non-subject. Let's see how this strategy gets reanalyzed in the heritage speaker. So if you look at Spanish L1 and heritage speaker in the work by Keating and Jagursky, they show that both groups, L1 and heritage speakers, still have the bias of interpreting the null pronoun as the subject. But the bias of interpreting the overt pronoun as a non-subject is only found in monolinguals. In other words, heritage speakers try to interpret any pronoun, be that null or overt, as referring back to the subject, which goes back to this idea that the subject position is more salient, more accessible to syntactic computation. And they basically don't bother to look anywhere further down in the structure. So that's an illustration that higher specifiers do hold special status in grammatical computation. So we do see some examples that heritage speakers are sensitive not only to the salience in terms of perceptual segments, but to this abstract structural salience. And that means that if we understand structural salience better, that would allow us to predict areas of resilience in heritage grammars. So let me talk very briefly about indexicality, which is somewhat related to higher salience, and that is that categories that are inherently indexical tend to be resilient in heritage grammars, and these include demonstrative determiners and absolute tense. So I already showed you that tense is quite resilient, but here's an interesting example which shows that the languages where the highest inflectional head is associated with aspect lose that feature, and that head is reanalyzed as tense because of the indexical nature of tense. So if we look at heritage varieties of mine, this is where we find examples of that. So mine clauses are headed by aspectual phrase, not by tense phrase. That's been shown extensively in the work by Judith Asen. And we can rely on well-known differences between aspect and tense to see what actually happens when we compare baseline Mayan and heritage Mayan. So if you look at stative verbs like know, understand, be told, be intelligent, if those are associated with aspect, we shouldn't be having the imperfective. Whereas if the form that we can analyze either as aspect or tense is tense, then the non-past form is possible with things like know. We can say, I know, I understand, I'm told. Past tense adverbials should not co-occur with imperfective, but they should co-occur, with imperfective, but they cannot co-occur with non-past. Future time adverbials is just the opposite. They can co-occur with perfective, but cannot co-occur with past. And then adverbials still or yet can co-occur with perfective and imperfective, but cannot co-occur with past. So these are all well known, so I'm not telling you anything that we don't know here. But now let's take a look at how these diagnostics apply to Mayan languages. So if we take Kakchikel, which is one of the Mayan languages, has two verb markers, sh and na. Sh is traditionally analyzed as perfective, na is imperfective. And if you look at the diagnostics, you can see that in the baseline Kakchikel, this sha and na behave, these sha and na behave exactly like aspectual markers. So na cannot occur with verbs like know, understand, and substatives. Oops, sorry. The past tense adverbials cannot occur with verbs prefixed with na. Future time adverbials cannot occur with verbs prefixed with sha. And then adverbials still and yet can occur with na and sha. So everything that we know about aspect and what ASIN actually uses to show that these are aspects. But now let's take a look at the baseline and heritage speakers. So far, we've only tested 3 people, so this is very preliminary, but this was a comprehension study. So as I said, in the baseline, stative verbs cannot occur with na. Heritage speakers allow those. Past tense adverbial cannot occur with na verbs. Heritage speakers allow that. Future time adverbials cannot occur with sha. Heritage speakers allow sha forms, which are traditionally perfective, to co-occur with future time adverbials. And then the adverbials still and yet can only co-occur with na. So this indicates that these heritage speakers actually do reanalyze the aspectual marking as tense marking. And what I would like to contend is that this is related to indexicality, to the idea that these speakers see the markers as pointing to absolute tense with respect to the moment of speech. I was going to talk a little more about linear distance and structural distance, but because we are very short on time, I'm just going to give you like the bullet points and post the slides, and then we'll be happy to answer questions. So what we find extremely difficult for heritage speakers is that they have trouble associating segments which are separated by other language materials. So this has been shown recently for Russian discontinuous noun phrases. Russian has subscrambling, and so heritage speakers cannot deal with that. And I've had some work which shows the same for Mandarin classifier constructions. So in Mandarin, the classifier and the classified noun can be separated by intervening material. And what we see is that when the Mandarin classifier and the noun that it's associated with are separated, like in this slide, heritage speakers have a lot of problems. So in this case, you see sentences, Zhang San ruined these 3 thick math books by accident. So what you have here is that 3, and then you have 3 classifiers. One is the classifier that actually goes with the word book, Ben. Then you have the classifier, which is semantically appropriate, pian, but it doesn't go with books. And then you have the classifier for tree, which is both semantically and formally inappropriate. Then you have 2 intervening words, thick and math, and then you have the word book. And so what happens is you give your heritage speakers the forms and ask them whether it's acceptable or unacceptable, and you see how they evaluate them. And the comparison is between forms like in this example, and also the forms where the classifier and the noun are adjacent, where you don't have these 2 words separating the blue and the red. So let's see what happens. And what you're going to see is not only the difficulty for the distance, but you also see the difference between adults and children. So if you look at heritage speaker children, so these are bilingual Mandarin speakers living in the United States, average age 8.5. These are, I would call them future heritage speakers. They are equally accurate at identifying the adjacent classifier and classifier at the distance. If you look at the adults, you can see that the adults are more or less a chance when it comes to adjacent classifiers, so they accept things which they shouldn't be accepting. And you can see how poorly they perform when the classifier is at a distance. They actually accept pretty much everything. So that indicates that linear distance between elements is quite difficult for heritage speakers, but it's also instructive that we see this difference between children and adults, showing that the system may actually have been in place, and then it might have been reanalyzed over the lifespan because the speaker was not part of the ambient language system. So this suggests this reanalysis in later stages of development. So it's going to talk a little bit about structural distance, but I'm going to skip that because we don't have much time. The point was that heritage speakers show sensitivity to higher structural constituents as subjects, but this sensitivity is not just specific to subjects. If you compare indirect objects and direct objects, you also see that the one that is structurally higher will be privileged in the heritage system. In heritage Georgian, we see that in relation to dative objects, which always win over nominative or accusative objects. Then there are some, what I would call cumulative effects, where we can combine structural salience and indexicality, and that together may be responsible for the resilience of tense categories and person agreement. We also see what's called extreme subject preference. I showed you the examples from Spanish, where regardless of whether the pronoun is null or overt, Spanish speakers actually interpret it as co-referent with the subject antecedent. And then finally, back to age of acquisition, something that I was going to talk about very briefly. We know that structures that are learned late may not be acquired at all, or may be not fully entrenched. We also have a lot of evidence of age of acquisition effect in the lexicon and the knowledge of registers. This is all kind of expected, but it's also important to look at the acquisition of grammatical features. And there's an interesting example which I brought up in passing when I talked about European heritage, Portuguese in the heritage variety, where the grammatical feature animate, and I want to emphasize it's the grammatical feature animate, not animacy as sort of a conceptual feature, but the grammatical feature animate is acquired fairly late. And that leads to a different use of null objects in heritage European Portuguese. In particular, because this feature is acquired late, you don't have minus animate on null objects in heritage European Portuguese. So you've got a totally different system, which could be due to this late acquisition of an abstract grammatical feature. I'm gonna skip DOM and just going back to my list of factors, which I don't think is exhaustive, but the hope is that we could actually arrive at an exhaustive list. And that list includes perceptual salience and structural salience, indexicality, which is tense or determiners or demonstrative, linear and structural distance, and age of acquisition. And so most of the data examined here, or I tried to examine most of the data based on comprehension. And some of the changes that we observe and predict may be rooted in processing difficulties and what's called the mapping problem, online resource limitations. In other words, it could be that it's not part of the grammatical system, but just something that's associated with processing difficulties. If you look at the factors which I've covered, perceptual salience is definitely associated with processing difficulty. Structural salience is probably associated with it indirectly. Indexicality, which plays a significant role in heritage grammars, does not seem to be associated with processing difficulty or processing ease. Structural distance, just as structural salience, may only be indirectly connected to processing difficulty. Linear distance is connected to processing difficulty, and then age of acquisition may only be indirectly connected to processing difficulty. So the point I want to make here is that the difficulties or the changes that we see in heritage grammars are not all about processing, although some of the triggers may be rooted in processing, but then what you have is the deep changes that happen in grammars, which, although triggered by the mapping problem, are later due to the internal change in the grammar of the language. So the resulting grammars then have a number of recurrent characteristics, which include resistance to irregularity, avoidance of ambiguity, what Greg's contrast and I call structural streamlining, where we have either fewer nodes or some nodes are just inert. And that leads us to the observation which I started with, and that is that a heritage language is a coherent linguistic system. And the principles and features that we see in that system are not different from what we observe in baseline grammars. The important thing is that not all the differences that we see between a heritage language and the corresponding baseline are due to simplification. Rather, what we see is this encroachment of the core, the regularity, as compared to the baseline. And we see that in the absence of irregular morphology, and something that I didn't talk about today, and that is absence of non-compositional expressions. Anybody who has dealt with heritage speakers knows that they don't understand idioms, they don't understand humor, and that's because anything that's non-compositional throws them off. It's, again, this kind of periphery which is not regular and is very difficult in this system. So I go back to the question that I think is extremely important at this current stage of our understanding of these grammars, and that is whether or not we can predict the differences between a heritage language and the baseline. And the answer is in principle, yes, but we still have to do a lot of work because we need to identify all and only factors that determine the differences between heritage languages and the baseline. We need to use the production data for descriptive generalization, and then using those production data, create comprehension experiments which could potentially identify different underlying presentations. And I think this is where the field is now and where we can actually get a lot of interesting work done. So thank you very much, and thank you for this whole, difficult connection, but now I think I can look at the questions. Okay. All right, so what do we do now?
Thank you very much for the talk. So there are, so chat room is kind of diverse. There are questions there as well. Yeah.
Okay, so Rumiana says that some of my errors were spectral errors, not exactly tense errors. Yeah, I did pull them all together, but a lot of the errors that were there were tense errors, and what we see is that heritage speakers are quite sensitive to that. It's difficult to show independently what exactly constitutes tense and what is aspect. So these are all questions about English progressives. Yeah, and I agree that the Mayan data are more interesting in terms of the aspectual. Okay. Why should heritage languages be studied separately? Aren't they just bilinguals and should be studied as such? How different are they from regular bilinguals? I don't think they are much different. The only difference is that these are so-called weaker bilinguals or imbalanced bilinguals. What's the influence of literacy on heritage grammar, for example, supplementary education? There is some work which shows that heritage speakers actually improve when they go through classes, but the question is how lasting this improvement is, and that's where we don't know. It would be important to look at people who go through a class, improve, and see how long they retain whatever gains they made in class. Okay, so Bjorn, have a more general question about the relationship of indexicality to processing. Go ahead. Okay, you have to unmute him.
Yeah.
You are unmuted, Bjorn. I think you muted yourself once again. Yeah, so now you can go.
Yes, okay.
Gillian will go.
Yeah, it's my question, not Bjorn, actually.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah, so in your final checklist there, when you were asking the question whether any of these problem areas that heritage speakers seem to have could be put at the door of processing difficulties, and you look through some of them, and some of them seem obviously analyzable in those terms. And then there was one category you had there, the indexicality thing, where you said, no, well, that one, maybe not. And I was going to say, well, not so fast, maybe so. And the reason is that one of the features of indexical reference is that, in fact, finding the referent of an indexical item is immediate and obvious and requires no processing, in the sense of you don't need to do complex reference tracking because it is immediately and saliently obvious from the context who the I is and who the you is. I would put indexicality on one side and anaphoric on the other. And the heritage language users seem to have a lot of problems with pronouns and with reference tracking. So when it's not indexical, when you actually have to figure out who it is, and then in discourse context relate those to each other, that is seems to me would incur greater processing demands than the indexical. The indexical I is actually the easiest reference to resolve. So indexicals, even though some people think, you know, philosophically and semantically they're complex because our systems of formal semantics are actually not very well suited to understanding them. And we tend to do them right at the end. And it makes us think, oh, it's pragmatics or it's an interface phenomenon. But I think that's actually deeply, deeply wrong. I think that the indexical is deep at the heart of a lot of this lexical content and is extremely easy and extremely salient and requires less overt reference tracking and processing than anaphoric expressions. So
that's very helpful, and I agree. What about determiners? Because they also do very well in determiners.
Yeah, so I think the ones, so what you're going to find is, I think that the ones that are like this and that are tied to context are going to be easy, but the ones that are just like the or discourse anaphoric. So there's, in English, I mean, I don't know about these other languages. In English,
well on discourse anaphoric too.
They do well on those?
They do well on the and or, you know, in Romance on their equivalents. So that gives me pause, because I agree with you that the kind of superficial indexicality as opposed to anaphoric tracking could be related to processing. Like how much do I need to do to search for a referent? But that would predict that they shouldn't be so good with determiners, but they actually are. So that either we should put them into separate bins, in which case your explanation still stands, and then we have the difference between
we have to distinguish between correct use of determiners, because the versus are is just in response to whether something is familiar or not, and the process of reference tracking.
No, I'm talking about comprehension studies, because for English we've done that. And, you know, if you look at English speakers who live in Israel or who live in Japan, their dominant languages don't have determiners and they don't make mistakes in comprehension. So they recognize.
But is it grammaticality, or is it figuring out who was meant? So sometimes when you do tests on pronouns, so when you discuss the tests on pronouns with the overt versus non-overt, it's always, okay, who does this refer to? Whereas if you're testing determiners, it's kind of like, is this grammatical or is this ungrammatical? So I'm just wondering what exactly is being tested with respect to these things.
Yeah, I think we can say both, because, you know, we've tried both, but I'm very sympathetic to the idea that tense, absolute tense, and personal pronouns and personal agreement are all due to less search. Although I'm not so certain about personal agreement. These people never make errors in personal agreement, and they don't accept personal agreement errors. So that would be a little harder to explain in terms of processing. But then they also do extremely well in determiners. And you're right, they don't do well on anaphoric pronouns. So if we could...
When you come to the person versus number gender distinction, that's also indexicality, right? You use that example. Yeah.
That's exactly my point. So what you see, I mean, you can say, okay, it's the Reader-Harley hierarchy, but that's just, the hierarchy is a generalization on some more profound observation. So the ideas behind the hierarchy is that person is indexical, number and gender are something else, and they, both in production and in comprehension, they confuse gender and number, but they never accept any person errors. And so I wonder how that would
go with the idea of like, okay, I don't need to track anyone when I'm doing person agreement, because that also involves some morphology.
Yeah, but I mean, person, it's marked on first and second, then you don't need to do any reference tracking at all. If it's third person, which very often is the least marked, right? That's when you need the number and the gender to kick in to figure out who it is, and that's where the problems arise.
Well, not necessarily, because there are some languages where you see number or gender marked on first and second person as well. So let's say you have the plural. So then we have another.
Yeah. So that would be a test case, the where you have the participant pronouns, and whether there is something formal about the gender, number, syntactic features, or whether it's something salient about the participants in the context.
So, for example, in Georgian, you have person and number marked pretty much everywhere. You can sneeze without, marking both in Georgian. And heritage speakers of Georgian, there is a person who studies them, Kessler in New York, and he shows consistently they do well in person. They constantly lose number. There's no gender. So that's just one of the languages that comes to mind. English is easy. In English, of course, the third person S is very easy to lose, or what they do is either they lose it all the time or they do it twice. It's like, let's do it as much as we can. But I'm like I said, I'm very keen on tying the indexicality with processing, but I think we might end up with just cutting the pie a little differently. We'll have indexicality that's connected to processing, and some pieces of indexicality, or some pieces of, let's say, T and D domain, which are not related to simple search in real space, to put it this way.
Okay, well, I'll give somebody else a chance now.
There was a question from Roberta, who left.
Oh yeah, about mood.
Yeah.
She says that the prediction is that mood will be like baseline speakers. Yes, typically, well, mood can be in different parts of the tree. If mood is very high, it's higher than the tense. They do well, but there is also a lot of modality, which is associated with what we are often associating with mood, and they don't do well on those. So this is one of the areas that hasn't been studied well enough, and so we need more. But for example, evidentials seem to, which is very high, seem to be fine. They know them.
There were some more questions from Bjorn, I guess, but I don't know. Or Julian.
I think those were from Jillian.
Okay.
Can we just ask questions?
Go ahead.
Okay, so Masha, it's Jason. How are you?
Hi. Good
I
to
wish you were here so that we could see you in person, but thank you for doing this. So I have a general question, and the general question relates to the desire for prediction, right? So I think, you've gone over just an incredible amount of very impressive work, and these patterns are there and they're undeniable. The question relates to how we work backwards. We reverse engineer from these observations to predict, right? I mean, I agree. That's exactly what we want to do. And what I want to ask and kind of challenge a little bit is the indexicality, no pun intended, of claims. So when we say heritage languages look like X, right? Mm-hmm. The question becomes, what is definitely true is that the heritage speakers, 30 at most, maybe 35 in any given study, certainly look like this. or the average does, right? Because we also know that, you know, in many of the studies, I don't know all the ones that you've gone over, but in some that I'm quite familiar with, there is some individual variation across the group if you're looking at individuals, right? And so the question becomes, if we want to reverse engineer backwards to say we can predict, I'm not sure I understand what you mean by that, but if you want to predict at the individual level, not just at an observational level of what might be true of a cohort, what do we do with the rampant individual differences that we see? So to give you a tangible example, because you're talking about English, that's the language that we all have. Amongst the, I didn't look and see who's there, but, you know, just in Tromsø, we have lots of people who have English heritage speaker children, right? And what I can tell you from my observations as a native speaker from them is that most of them don't sound like the example that you actually gave us. And some of them, Merete, if you're there, her children, sound more British to me than British people, and I lived in the UK for 6 years. And so my question is it really true to say that heritage speakers of English always do not have inverse scope? And if that's not necessarily true, I think the question, and as it relates to prediction, is what are the conditions under which the observation that you have from a study that potentially is populated by people who are heritage speakers that sound to have the proficiency level that you showed to us, what is it about them and their background, the inputs that they've had, the quantifiable nature of the reductions of the input that they potentially have had compared to Vidar, for example, who's also a child, so we don't know how that'll turn out, but to Beretta's children who are in university now, and I don't know, but I would guess they probably do have inverse scope readings, right? So if we want to say that this is true, if we want to predict, I guess we want to predict to say heritage English looks like this. But if the conditions that contribute to heritage English can vary so much, and we have individual variation that in domains that are not attested in the same way, even when we adjust for SES and education and monolinguals, how do we go about making predictions to say, a priori, we think if you are a heritage speaker of English, you will need to look like this? Do you really think that all heritage speakers of English are described by what the 30 people did with inverse scope in your study? And then that is true for all languages, right? So I wonder how we do, if you agree at all, if you think, because, you know, you've made no mention of individual variation, right? And so you're talking about heritage Spanish and heritage Georgian and heritage whatever. How confident are you that that describes everybody who fits under that label? And if you're not, what does this mean for prediction, which I think we all agree we want? How do we do that?
So how do we predict that the sound pattern of English applies to all English speakers? So I think we're looking at variation from, in any population, anybody who has taught formal syntax knows that when you go into the classroom and introduce a sentence that we all know and love, half of your class will accept what we think is a star, and the other half will, you know, not accept it. So we have this issue of variation all over the place.
Right.
So I don't think it's unique to heritage speakers. My goal is just to look at this particular population. Someone correctly asked the question, you know, how are they different from bilinguals? They're not, you know, they're just bilinguals who don't use their language that much. But I think this is an issue for any linguist, not just for people who work on heritage languages. So when we study, I don't know, Spanish or Norwegian, there is variation all over the place. So we need to, as a field, we need to find ways to handle it. If you go back to some of the slides, I did talk about differences between more and less proficient speakers. So for example, in the Inuktitut study, they had a lexical measure which allowed them to compare the people who were more proficient and less proficient, and they used that lexical measure to divide them into two groups. And then when they gave them tense mismatches, turned out that, you know, the lexically more proficient and the lexically less proficient people actually acted the same exact way. Whenever we do our own studies, I always have independent measures, which will be a rate of speech. So we give them, that's why we give them video clips to talk about. We measure how many words per minute they use in their dominant language and in their heritage language. And then you can, with modern stats, you can put a lot of stuff in the stats. And you can also use very simple lexical measures like the holo test. So the more we put into our models, the more predictive they're going to be. But I totally agree with your question. And what I would like to make sure of is that the onus is not on people who work on heritage, but the onus is on people who work on language, because this is something that applies to everybody. Take a good processing study of monolinguals. How many people do they usually study? 40, 50, 60. So that means, if we're looking at the large language, can we say this is everywhere? Probably not. So that's a kind of a general answer to your question.
Can I just follow up quickly?
Sure.
I mean, I totally agree with you. Of course, there's variation, and we tend to ignore lots of variation within, dominant native speaker cohorts that are of a particular type that we tend to look at. But, it would not be an exaggeration to say that the variation of obligatory S marking and third person present in English is not something that varies to the degree that I think we might see, and I think you've suggested varies, or it doesn't exist for heritage speakers. And the question really becomes, if heritage speakers are also a natural laboratory to figure out other related, more larger theoretical questions, like what is the threshold? Potentially, this is one question. What is the threshold of reduction in input that gives rise to these cascading effects that are clearly very principled in a way that you're showing? And I think this work shows. Then minimally, we want to really be more cognizant, if you will, of the variations of particular proxies that might give rise to this. And I think acknowledge the fact that there is a gradient of variation within heritage speakers that surpasses that which is the normal threshold of what we see within monolingualism. And there might be very many reasons for that, right? Heritage speakers don't have experience with their language that is the great equalizer, things like education and standardization and so on and so forth. So if one of the benefits of looking at heritage speakers is to see, well, what happens under a context of reduced input, then equally, I think it's important to understand that we can use different proxies for heritage speakers to say, not all of them actually look like the way that we're describing with an aggregate analysis, but indeed, there are principled reasons for which some may or may not differ on a continuum, and that relates to ultimately opportunities for convergence, right? And so that was the spirit of my question. And so I try not.
What you're saying is that we need to look at the amount of input, which is very important. That can only be done through modeling, because you can't track every speaker. So now what we can do as a field working on these languages is propose various criteria, propose various factors, which is what I've done here, and then try to feed that into interesting computational models, which would then make predictions as to, how much input is too much, how much input is too little, how much input do they need in order to then recover and become more proficient, or how much input will last a little longer or less long. So I think there is no way to answer these. So you're right about the input, but there's no way to answer it using the tools that we've been using as a field. That has to come from a different subfield.
Agreed.
But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be asking the question. And yes, the answer to individual differences is twofold. One, yes, they exist, and they vary depending on input, motivation. Some speakers are just better than others. The other thing is, because we are becoming more and more proficient as a field in terms of averaging over differences, of individual differences, we should just try to use current models of language, experimental work on language to either downplay or emphasize the differences, depending on what we want.
Agreed.
Okay.
I
Thanks.
think Rumiana has a question, right?
Huh?
So unmute Rumiana now. Rumiana, are you here?
Yeah, I muted myself again. Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Masha, for a wonderful, very thought-provoking.
Oops. Romana, we can't hear you. Hello?
Yes.
Oh,
Can you hear me?
now
Can you
yes.
hear me now? Okay,
Yeah.
sorry. I had headphones. Right, so thank you for a very thought-provoking talk, I said, and I want to push you to make a further prediction with respect to second language learners, because to me, it seems that the logic is the following. You relate less input with the regularization of the grammar. So using the core grammar, not the periphery. And that makes a lot of sense. But another population that we know is the second language learners, who also have less input than, let's say, dominant speakers or native speakers, whatever we want to call them. So would you make the prediction that the same regularization of the grammar that we see in heritage learners, we are going to see with second language speakers as well?
I wouldn't make any predictions because whenever it comes to L2, I defer to you. And
Yeah. No.
I also think that the two grammars in the L2 acquisition are related in some very different way than the two grammars in a bilingual. So I don't
Yes. Yes.
know. Jason was going to say
Jason,
something.
mute yourself, please.
No, he was going to say something, I think.
I was just going to agree completely with what you said. So, yeah, I completely agree with what Masha just said. I think that the relationship between the two grammars in principle can be and probably are very, very different. You know, one is being acquired from moment zero, and the other is after X and other languages had a point of time to develop. And so I think that the nature is quite different because, you know, Rumiana, as you know
Okay,
quite well.
so yes, sorry to stop you, but you're talking about the critical period hypothesis here. Can we hear Masha elaborate on this?
I really don't think, well, my main point is that the two grammars are handled, I don't know what the word to use, handled by competence in a completely different way. And whenever you have L2, the transfer from the dominant language, from the first language, is so strong that might mess up all the predictions about regularity that you can think of. Whereas when you have a bilingual, the two systems are sufficiently independent and they are sort of melting in their own pot without mixing with the other system. So that's the logic behind my saying that I don't think we can make any similar predictions about L2. But I would be, of course, very curious to know what you think.
Thank you very much. I mean, I don't know. This question just popped into my head, and I should talk to Jason as well. Thank you for your answer.
The three of us should talk, yeah.
Yeah.
But it sounds
Thank
like
you,
you need
Jason.
someone else because Jason and I are on one side and you may be outnumbered.
Oh, good. So don't worry. There are plenty of people on my side too.
Yeah, no, but my, jokes aside, I think this is a completely different system. And it's kind of amazing when you look at these bilinguals, how little transfer you find. And you do look for transfer, you look for abstract transfer. And it doesn't seem to take so much place, whereas transfer is such an important and prominent thing in L2. So that gives me a pause in making predictions.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Thanks.
Okay, let's see what the boss says.
Are there any more questions?
Well, you all know where I am, and it's recorded, and the hackers know too. So I'm happy to answer questions over email later on.
Bjorn has a question about the particle placement.
I don't know if it's Bjorn or Jillian.
Or Jillian, yes. So
Go ahead.
you need to switch on your microphone. Yeah.
Yeah, sorry to have another question to bug you with, but I was just intrigued. It doesn't bear on any of these big overarching questions about heritage language versus second language learners. Sorry, I'm just intrigued about the data from the heritage English speakers on particle placement, because you said in passing that we have evidence that the heritage language English speakers have reanalyzed the particles in adverb. And you also said that they've lost the clitic status of the object pronouns. But I got a bit stuck because I was looking at what they're producing, and it seems to me that analyzing the particle as an adverb is not going to help them there. In fact, they can only come up with that word order if they have retained the exceptional status of the particle, right? So if they were excessively regularizing, they should never ever allow a direct object not to be directly adjacent to the verb. And they're allowing lock up me, which is very odd. So they must be retaining the exceptional status of the particle. They can't be analyzing it as an adverb, because if it were an adverb, then you could not have the object in that position. There is no native English speaker who will allow that. Yeah, so the only thing they're getting wrong, it seems to me, in that case, is the status of the object pronoun. So if they analyze the object pronoun as a full DP, because you can say lock up the man, but you can't say lock up him. So that is the only thing that'll explain that word order. In fact, it's very weird, right? Because it goes against regularization, and it goes against the reanalyzing the particle as an adverb.
Okay, I think, so my reasons for saying that the particle is reanalyzed as an adverb is that when the particle doesn't follow the verb directly, they allow it to scramble with other adverbs. So they will say, you know, locked the man yesterday up, stuff like that. So that was the reason where that was the main reason for which I thought that this might be adverbial. I think the point is well taken, in which case we'll have to say that they might have, you know, lexical verbs like lock up and then a particle separately.
Yeah.
And that particle will be adverbial. So that would lead to proliferation of lexical items, but so be it. That's not a big deal. But, you know, the problem with just saying this is still a particle is that you'll have to explain how they allow scrambling with adverbs when the particle is after the direct object, whatever the direct object is.
Okay. So then I understand now, because you didn't show that data, and so
right. I went over that data because I didn't have the time. But I think that, well, yeah, the only way to go then would be to say, okay, there are a bunch of particle verbs, you know, lock up, throw up. They use throw up only compositionally, and then there is a set of adverbs up, down, over, and those are scrambled with other adverbs.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Okay.
All right, yes. Thanks very much to the speaker and to everybody.
Thank you, Thank you, everybody, and good to see you all.
It was very nice seeing you, yes.
Thank you, bye-bye.